So in this tutorial, we're going to be looking at simplifying some complex shapes into some more simple ones. So when you're doing your sketching or sort of urban sketching, what you're probably going to want to do is take a really complex subject like this tree and simplify it. So let's look at 4 simple techniques for doing that. One of the things you want to note before we start actually getting into this, look at the light and shade on the tree. There is areas on the top sort of left-hand side. The sun is definitely coming from, I would say, about 10 o'clock in this image. There's some shade on the trunk, and there's a lot of shadow on the lower right-hand side. So needless to say, I am using the tree for reference really here in terms of the light and shade and the shapes. I'm not looking at replicating the perfect shape of that tree. So this is really more of a detailed drawing. I'm trying to capture some of the individual bits of foliage. Obviously, I've scaled up some of the leaves a little bit because I don't really want to be drawing that small and fiddly. I've tried to show a little bit of the structure of the tree in terms of where the trunk is. I've tried to use some crosshatching to show the form and the lights and the darks. As you can see, when I started on the bottom left and made my way up, but when I got to the top, I did sort of lose patience a bit and start to, simplify it even more. But that's less important really, because that's the area where you have the highlights. Now in this example, I've used a bit of negative space for my highlights, which is the reason why I've gone and painted that in blue, because you don't really have negative space until you actually put a colour on the background, if you know what I mean. That white really won't pop until you put a colour in. So that's our first example of slightly simplified. So let's have a look at the second example. Now what I've done here is I've clustered various bits of the tree together. So instead of sort of looking at those individual leaves and those individual bunches of leaves, I've sort of grouped them together a bit. So what you have effectively is the same as before. There is some detail underneath those big pods of leaves. You can still see the branches and things underneath, and there's shadow in there. So what I've tried to do is simplify the foliage sort of down really into big fluffy clumps. Again, a simplified version of the first one. So you can see what's happening here. There's a trend appearing. And again, I've put in the sky just so we get a sense of that negative space and how that's used to create the highlights on the tops of the leaves. Now you could put more detail in the trunk. You could probably do a little bit more pen work on this to try and really bring that contrast to life, with line thicknesses and more cross-hatching. But for the sake of this demo, I think that's fine. Okay, so if we go to the next version, this is an even more simplified version. I've basically done pretty much the same as what I did in the first one, but I've just kept those blobs a lot bigger. So instead of now there being, say, 20 sort of fluffy bits that make up the whole tree, there's maybe 10 in this. And it's just a lot more of a simplified version where you kind of look at the overall shape and then break it up into sort of various components. I mean, I could, again, put more cross-hatching and things in this to tell that story, but I think you get the idea. Now, the next stage would logically be a sort of lollipop tree or just a silhouette or something, but instead of doing that, what I've decided to do is show you how you can actually do a lot of the heavy lifting with watercolor. If you're drawing a tree, particularly if it's in the background, you can actually just draw a little bit of a trunk and a few branches and then use watercolor to give you a sort of silhouette of it. This is a slightly more complicated one where it's because this tree is really the hero. What I've tried to do is use some darker watercolor on the bottom, and then I've dotted in a little bit of lemon yellow in the tops of and that's just created a bit of a sort of shadow area and a bit of contrast. You didn't really need to put the brown of the trunk in, I don't think it necessarily even needed it, but I put it in anyway. So that's it really. That's the 4 different ways you can approach trees. There is, like anything in life, there's probably hundreds of different ways you could do trees, and I like to try lots of different versions. One of the things I would say is that often if you're drawing trees in the foreground, they're going to look very different to trees in the background, as you can see from these photos here. Your foreground trees will have a lot more contrast, they'll have a lot more detail in. And as they get into the background, they can just be a single wash of watercolor or just a sort of cross-hatched area. And one of the things, if you want to practice drawing trees, one of the most useful bits of advice would be, to download some pictures and or go out into the countryside and just focus on that, that element. So I hope you found that useful. There's lots of other tree-related exercises on my Patreon, so do check that out. And we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.